It is true that we fired tranquilizer bullets to draw blood.
But we did not kill the gorillas. There is no blood on my hands. I was a businessman, a retired tour guide. His gaze turned to the judge. You could fabricate a testimony. Money changes what people say, but a dead animal can't change its words. Alphonse closed his eyes for a moment, then smiled bitterly. If I'm guilty, it's that I bribed my way through the border, that I trusted others. That's all. But we're not murderers. At least that I deny with my life. He said nothing more. The courtroom fell silent. For a moment, the courtroom was silent. A 10-minute recess. A moment of tense breaths. The judge returned, and with a blank expression, he began to read the sentence. Defendant Alphonse is sentenced to 60 hours of community service and a 1-year ban on entry to wildlife sanctuaries. Furthermore, as Kim Min-cheol and Oteng's other key figures in this case are absent, the court will determine their whereabouts to be missing, suspend the trial for 1 year, and order their deportation as foreigners. If their deaths are confirmed through a declaration of disappearance, the charges will be dismissed. However, taking into account their remorse, psychological turmoil, and social environment, the court will require them to participate in a 4-hour National Recidivism Prevention Program. After those words, Alphonse lowered his head. His lips trembled slightly. It was neither anger nor joy. It was the expression of an actor who had delivered his lines well. Alphonse raised his head and glanced at me. I read a silent sentence in his eyes. The law is branding me a smuggler. Smugglers are inevitably born from an imperfect system and environment. It was inevitable. The language of the courtroom failed to resonate, and he had no choice but to become a true poacher, armed with a gun for a living. As they left the courtroom, Alphonse and Peter held hands, their hands filled with emotion. He sensed that another guide had moved in, accordance with our team's schedule. Peter, you've leaked a lot of information to the NGO. We were all already hunted by their scheme. Trapped in an invisible food chain, we were trapped, more alone than animals, thrown into the law's net. Madame Marie offered a polite thank you to the prosecutor. The priority was to prevent the illegal use of the evidence for the indictment from being revealed. To prevent further controversy, Peter had dropped the charges. A small conversation raged in the back row of the gallery. A French embassy official in a dark suit scanned the courtroom over his glasses and whispered to a reporter, "The sentence is lenient. I'll report it to headquarters in Paris." See, as always, the trial here merely mimics the process. The indictment is flimsy and the evidence is weak, but the outcome is already decided. The reporter squinted his eyes, scribbling repeatedly in his notebook. The outcome expulsion, isn't it? That's the way this country works. Punish, but don't keep them in custody for long. The employee's lips quirked up bitterly. That's right. They're conscious of the international media's attention. They show justice through formalities and ultimately settle things with expulsion. The goal isn't to hold this person truly accountable, but to save face for both sides. The reporter turned his gaze to the defendant's stand. Alphonse sat motionless. His face was neither angry nor fearful, but a strange mixture of resignation and determination. The reporter quietly added a note. The defendant's face bore the weight of a witness, not the stigma of a criminal. The reporter muttered, closing his notebook. Justice is always sold cheaply here, but that expression, it won't be easily erased. The local newspaper reporter next to him quietly shook his head. The photo, whose source is unknown, may not be evidence, but gorilla hunting is rampant here and there. Conservation is urgent. How can we control access to the forest? For a woman from Cross River or a Bamilite guide? How can we prevent border crossings in the unmarked jungle? It was a silent rebuke. Part 6. For the liberation of Yaoundé. One for the liberation of Yaoundé. The gorilla hunt exposed our own illusions. We faced each other on both sides of the Cross River. The river during the rainy season grew wider, submerging the coastal forest. Our view expanded far into the distance. The plaza where we stood also expanded, becoming a space where we could no longer remain. In this ideal, like fish in an aquarium, our lives drifting, dependent on only the oxygen and limited food allowed, were now coming to an end. We realized how fragile the lives of ourselves and our comrades, comforted by illusions, had been, and the true fight began in this reality where the river and plaza unfolded. In a hut at the riverbank ferry, an old radio lay alone. Low voices repeatedly crossed and disappeared, and this place was no longer part of the village, but the border of another world. In the deep darkness, the Gulf of Guinea refused to allow a single light, and the sea returned to only profound silence. There, where the rough waves and the traces of moonlight had vanished, it was as quiet as if we had reached the end of the world. A lone dugout raft waited on the shore, outriggers stretched out to either side, barely holding onto the dark water. It seemed precarious, as if a single gust of wind would tip it over. But perhaps that very precariousness was precisely what he had hoped for. Gazing at the waves, faintly illuminated by moonlight, even in the darkness, he grasped the sand with my fingertips and let it drift away. The sand, once scorched by the heat of the day, had already cooled, and the very coldness felt like relief. A wind blew from afar. The wind, rustling through the trees, carried a mixture of salt and the unfamiliar scent of grass. That smell strangely awakened memories from long ago, faces he had to leave, voices he could not return. All of it lay dormant, layered in the darkness of the sea. He slowly approached the dugout raft. The grain of the bark grazed his palms roughly. Within it were traces left by countless hands. Some had crossed this sea and survived, and others had seeped into this darkness. The moment he stepped onto the boat, he felt himself becoming part of the darkness. The waves rippled slightly and the boat rocked as if breathing. In that moment, the world sank into complete silence once again. He carefully lifted the oar. As the breath of the sea touched the tip of the oar, the cold water faintly spread across the scales. With the first stroke of the oar, the dugout shuddered, like a long dormant beast. The current parted, creating gentle ripples, and these ripples soon disappeared into the darkness as if nothing had happened. The waters of the Gulf of Guinea were black and heavy. On that surface, where not even moonlight reached, he had no idea where he was heading. Only the faint, distant direction of the wind, blowing from somewhere, seemed to indicate his path. He paused and listened for a moment. The heart of the sea still beat deeply and silently. In it, forgotten voices rose one by one. The shouts of the square, the falling shadows, and the faces he could never save. Every time he recalled those faces, he thrust his oar deeper. The oar seemed to burst into tears as it cut through the water. As those tears seeped into the sea, the waves rippled softly as if in response. I too had no choice but to leave. The words that escaped his lips were lost in the wind. They were a confession, and at the same time a spell begging for forgiveness. Leaving was a sin, and staying was a punishment. He was thrusting himself into the gap between the two for the last time. In the distance, lightning flashed across the sea. The sky remained silent, but a single ray of light briefly cut through the darkness. For a moment, the sea flashed like black silk. In that instant, he saw his own shadow slowly dissipating across the sea. He let go of the oars. His fingertips trembled briefly on the waves. Then they were absorbed into the silence. The dugout slid, driven by the wind, silently far away into the embrace of darkness. And then, as if nothing had happened, the Gulf of Guinea regained its silence. As if swallowing all secrets, the sea silently erased even his name and his breath. On the bow, the lamplight swayed with the waves, lengthening the shadows of the two men. The boat swayed like a small island, cut off from the world. A long wooden pole bound the main body like a bar, barely holding back the sea's sway. Emptiness filled him. The hollowed-out log, like his own inner self, swayed on the waves. He stood, camera slung over his shoulder, gun in hand, as if blocking the waves. The boat, silently preparing to take us somewhere else, was the threshold from which we departed the world we had been living in, the only bridge across a river from which there was no return. Kim Min-chol spoke quietly. "Is it true that Alphonse is wary of you?" Otangs turned his head, letting the wind brush his face. "Yes. There are already clear signs of division within the rebels. The popular forces and his laws are at odds, so if a united front rises to the surface, conflict is inevitable." Min-chol held a cigarette in his hand. Kim Min-chol gazed at the waves, tracing the shadow of the lamplight with his fingers. As the smoke drifted through his fingers, so did his thoughts. "Otangs, you still talk about the liberation of the people, but I think we need to understand the structure first." She smiled like a light in the darkness. "Min-chol structure alone doesn't move people. Revolution begins with human will, human suffering, and human dreams." He squinted his eyes, blowing smoke.